Hi, Lenny.
Hi, Nancy.
Welcome to Season 1, Episode 12 of the Front Porch Book Club.
The Front Porch Book Club is a podcast that meets twice a month.
And we dig deep into the relationship between characters and the worlds they live in.
Grab your book and iced tea and join us on the front porch.
Linda, I feel like every time we start a podcast, we say this book is completely different from any other book we've done.
We have a very diverse group of books.
We do. So once again, we have a very different book, and we're excited to interview the author of the NGO Game, Dr. Patrice McMahon. And this is a scholarly book looking at the role of NGOs in post-conflict countries. Specifically, she was looking at the Balkans, in Kosovo, and Bosnia.
Nance, you know Patrice, right?
I do. I was very lucky to be a colleague of Patrice's at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Aside from that, and more importantly, got to know her through family. And Patrice is an amazing scholar, but also just the most wonderful person you would ever want to meet. Just warm and generous and inviting. And then when it comes to her scholarly work, just second to none in terms of political science.
Well, she's won a lot of awards, hasn't she?
She really has. She is a professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She's also the director of the University Honors Program and the Dean's Professor of Teaching and Learning. You mentioned the awards. She's received a number of teaching awards. And so these are just like some of the more recent ones I'm going to talk about. She's won the Dean's Award for Excellence in Graduate Education, the Outstanding Educator of the Year Award, the Best in Class at UNL, the Arts and Science College Distinguished Teaching Award. So yeah, she's quite decorated. Her students love her. I know a number of students who have taken classes from her and just speak so highly of her as an educator as well.
My goodness, and she gave us some time for our podcast, Nance.
I know. It's really great. This book is central to so many of her interests in research. Her research mostly focuses on humanitarian affairs, peacebuilding, NGOs, and U.S. foreign policy.
Some of that is right in my wheelhouse. I love the work that she's doing. And then I have this big blind side to the politics, reconstruction, economics. I'm compassionate. I want peace. I love humanitarian work, but she has both of those knowledge points, which listeners are going to really enjoy and be interested in what her book has to say about the money that is donated, where that money goes, and the effect that money has on the country and the people.
Yeah, this book is a really unflinching analysis of where we've gone wrong and some areas where we've done well.
Yeah, and she has some great advice for us too, as givers.
Oh, she does. So that's worth the price of admission right there.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's get to it.
Okay.
Welcome, Patrice.
Welcome, Patrice.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Nancy. I'm excited to be here.
Patrice, we loved reading your book. This book is really fairly critical about the impact of Western non-governmental organizations, and the acronym for that is NGOs, that enter post-conflict countries. Their intention is to transform these countries through peace building and civic education. In the book, and even in the title, you talk about the NGO Game. Can you talk to us about what that game is?
Yeah, thanks. So the NGO Game, I was really careful when I described and explained the NGO Game, because for me, it is something that for the most part is very unintentional. So the way I can summarize it quickly is it's good intentions gone awry. And sometimes the good intentions go awry because of lack of knowledge. Sometimes the good intentions go awry because of lack of willpower. Sometimes it's human error. Sometimes it's a desire for a different agenda. And it's really when organizations and individuals want to do good things and make positive changes in post-conflict and transitioning countries, but it's some of the unintentional consequences. Because it's not as though the NGOs or the people who are involved in post-conflict peace building inherently are bad, or they're even doing things sometimes that are awful. It's just sometimes it's this lack of knowledge or the disjuncture, the disconnect that exists when people live really far away and don't understand the domestic situation and what's happening on the ground.
You also talked about structural forces that really make it impossible for those good intentions to translate to positive outcomes. Can you talk about that kind of structural force?
Yeah, and that's where it gets a little academic. And I pulled out some of this as well, but I use organizational theories from economics to talk about these disjunctures. And I think a good way to explain this is the funding structure. So governments want, like the US government wanted to help out Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo after the conflict. At the same time, the US government has its own constituents that it has to respond to and be accountable to. They want to do good things. They want to spend money, help people in Bosnia. At the same time, they have domestic organizations and domestic interests that they also have to serve and respond to. And so sometimes those two are very different. You know, you have an organization, say in Nebraska, that wants to give wheat to people in Bosnia. The people in Bosnia don't really need wheat, right? They don't need food. They really don't. They want jobs or they want training. And so for the US government, it's how do they serve both of these different constituencies? Both are worthy and both have value. But sometimes for the post-conflict country and the people on the ground, they're like, no, we don't want your wheat. We don't want your food. These are the other things. Actually, in Africa, this one person said to me, stop sending t-shirts. We don't want any more t-shirts or clothes. Because Ethiopia, at a time when it was going through a lot of economic hardship, a lot of faith-based and secular NGOs were sending a lot of used clothes over to Ethiopia. So you see all of these used clothes and t-shirts, like that's not what we want anymore. We want these other things. And sometimes we just don't have the organizations or the resources to provide that.
There was one quote that you have in the book that just sticks with me. And it is one of the individuals who lives in Bosnia. And he said, thinking about the NGOs and the bust and the boom, he said, we waste Westerners' money and they waste our time. And so when you think about that disjuncture, that for me really seemed to capture that. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience hearing more about how they waste Westerners' money and we waste their time?
Yeah, and I've seen this a lot. Westerners, so I'll say Westerners, not just Americans, go over to post-conflict countries or were in the Balkans with a lot of money. They wanted to do good things. And I'm somebody who's interested in human rights. I'm interested in women's rights. And, I have the German Marshall Fund. I at one time worked for the German Marshall Fund. You go over to a country and it's like the Western agenda, what we want to focus on. So the locals listen and say, yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, human rights, women's rights, violence against women. And so they listen and shake their head because they need that attention. They need that money. They want Western involvement. And then they often, sometimes unintentionally carry out or engage in activities that local people really don't want. I mean, I use the violence against women campaign because that's one that I heard a lot in Central and Eastern Europe. And I spent a lot of time in Poland. And this was, a campaign that Western NGOs and Western governments were really interested in. It's a real issue here and in lots of countries, violence against women. And what women in some of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe were saying is, like, that's not an issue for us. I mean, it may be a problem, but that's not our top priority. But that's not where they're not giving out money for training, for professional development or business skills. They're giving out money for grants about violence against women. So that's the dynamic. And that's this kind of, disjuncture and the kind of institutional structures and how these organizations sometimes produce unfortunate and unintentional outcomes.
I'm thinking like the violence against women is a pretty hefty chunk of change. And if you throw that out there, hey, this is our campaign, this is what we want our money to go through, there's a lot of women in Western culture that are like, yes, that's what I'll fund. That's where my money's going to go. And then maybe that money isn't really needed. So is it, we know that there's money there and there's givers there, and we're trying to funnel it in to be used in this new government that's emerging.
That's exactly it, Linda. We would all give money for campaigns, for projects, probably in any country, that are focused on women, women's empowerment. And for us, that resonates. It's something we've heard about. We know it's an issue in the United States. Again, I'm not saying it's not an issue in other countries, but when I've talked to women in Bosnia and Kosovo, in Poland, in Russia, about some of the campaigns and the calls for proposals that Western governments or non-governmental organizations are involved with, they would say things like, that is not our priority. A lot of the stuff, which was interesting to me and not surprising, is their priority is like, they want jobs. They want training for better jobs, and they want to take care of themselves. They don't want our donations. They don't want us to decide what issues are a priority. And so it was just, for me, it's like, well, why can't we help them with jobs promotion? And that just doesn't sell as well. People, aren't as emotionally invested. And that was also something that I heard from locals saying, tell these people to stop taking pictures of our poor kids. Like, that's not what Bosnia is about. There's a lot of other things that are going on, but that is not something that the NGOs can take home and sell and promote themselves. Yeah, it's kind of like a business for the NGOs as well, right? Again, it's not saying they're not doing good things, but they're also doing things that help themselves and promote their own agenda.
Yeah, you focused your book basically on the Balkans, particularly Bosnia and Kosovo, which I remember a little bit, but I must have been doing something else, I hate to say, during that period, or I just forgot about it. But I do remember those little kids and that they needed my money. I do remember that. But can you please just kind of remind us about what was going on with those wars and why you chose that particular war to focus your book on?
Yeah. So what started to happen in the early 1990s, if you remember, there was this rejection of communism throughout Eastern Europe. And in the former Yugoslavia, things started to implode around 1991. And the republics started to kind of break away or wanted to become independent. And by 1991, 92, things started to get really bloody and awful. There was a short war with Slovenia, a longer war with Croatia. The war with Bosnia lasted about 3 years or 3.5 years. And some people say it's the first genocide since World War II. So it was, thousands of people who were killed, and women who were systematically raped, and Muslim women who were targeted. So I picked Bosnia and got involved in the former Yugoslavia, and particularly in Bosnia, because of the extent of the violence and bloodshed, but also because when the war ended and the United States led those efforts in 1995 to end the conflict in Bosnia, and we got extensively and intensively involved in the Balkans, and so did about 30 other countries. So it was a huge international undertaking, and there was lots of money that was spent in the Balkans, a lot of military effort, a big military coalition that was SFOR, the stabilization force, and then lots of international NGOs that got involved in the conflict. And so when I first went over to the former Yugoslavia, it was in September of 2000, and I was sent over with an interdisciplinary team of scholars and medical doctors through the National Research Council. And basically I was sent over 3 times to just look at what the international community had done in Bosnia. And I said I was interested in women's issues, I was interested in human rights, ethnic issues. So we went in different groups at different times to just basically look at what the international community had done, how we had spent our money, and for us to develop reports on the impact of international assistance in Bosnia. What I noticed when I went in 2000 was just all of these international and local NGOs. And I was so inspired, overwhelmed. It was exciting. I just didn't expect that there would be so many international NGOs, and they were just everywhere. And so that's why I became involved in Bosnia and then later went to Kosovo for some of the same reasons. We also spent a ton of money and military effort and financial assistance to help support Kosovo as well.
In your book, you talk about Kosovo being a copy, paste, and delete of the Bosnia NGO experience.
Yeah, that came from somebody in a town called Mitrovica, which is still a divided town in Kosovo. And what this guy was telling me is that on more than one call for proposals for grants, they basically had taken out like the name of some African country and put in Kosovo. His comment was just that, we appreciate what some Western countries and NGOs want to do, but there really needs to be more careful attention to local conditions. His argument was Kosovo, it was very different from Bosnia, even though to some of us in the US or in the West, it just was another Balkan country. He was thinking, we're really different. And they didn't take a differential approach to us as a country receiving aid. And not surprisingly, not a lot happened.
That was one of the things in the book that was so disturbing, the extent to which these NGOs, they just didn't take local conditions. They didn't understand the culture, the language even. They didn't take any of that into account. They came in with this template that they wanted to apply, assuming that we in the West must know best, that our methods are the methods that should be used, and we just needed to conform their government, their society, their culture in our image.
Yeah, it's unfortunately an old story that's been told in different ways and has developed in different ways, but it is similar to a lot of the financial approach and the aid that we applied to Africa in the 1950s and 60s. And it just became part of the post-conflict reconstruction and development paradigm in the 1990s. And there were lots of countries that in some ways were similar. They were tortured countries that the West knew little about. And so they felt like, we know democracy, we know capitalism and civil society, and we'll take those three together. All good things go together, and we'll promote democratic institutions, capitalist economic structures, and a vibrant civil society. And how they did it or how it looked, those details were never fully ironed out, but it's this liberal internationalist agenda.
And you talk about how some of that is Cold War, post-Cold War, that Western goal of transforming countries rather than just stopping at providing direct aid or assistance or recovery. And that's really where you focus, not so much on the NGO work that is providing that kind of immediate emergency assistance, but more that peace building, that societal transformation work. Do I have that right?
Exactly. And that's what we call liberal internationalism. This idea that we're promoting democracy, also promoting certain kinds of capitalist economic structures. We don't talk about that as much. We really kind of emphasize democracy, freedom, civil society, human rights, but incorporated in that as well, and I would say is even more fundamental, are these economic structures, these economic trade-offs and agreements with these countries that we believe, we hope will become our allies and buy things from us.
Oh, so it's about the money.
Yeah, I know, it shocks you. This is also a book that's about what we call everyday politics. So I interviewed a lot of people who are everyday people who are involved in NGOs or live in small towns or live in small villages. And so many people were like, look, we appreciate that you're here and you want to do things, but really we just want good jobs. We want to be trained. And, and some of those things are obviously, they're just too big for NGOs to take on. But you can see how people are saying, yeah, this is good. And we understand why it's important to have a rich civil society, but it's really important for us to have jobs that pay. And part of the problem and the really depressing part of all this for me is that the Balkans still suffers from such high unemployment. I mean, it's, official unemployment is maybe 40 or 50%, but in some places it's 60 or 70%.
Wow.
There's just aren't jobs for people. And so this is a much bigger issue, and NGOs are kind of like a Band-Aid. They're doing some good things and they keep people busy. They keep certainly Westerners employed and giving them pretty decent jobs. But on the ground, I mean, that's one of the things I have to say that Oxfam has done some really good research looking at how much of the international aid actually goes to local NGOs. And the statistic that I have that is kind of dated now, but it was from like 2007 to 2013, less than 2% of the money that was going to certain pots of international aid, less than 2% were going to local NGOs.
It's incredible.
So it was mostly going, to pay Westerners to fly, including me. I mean, I went over not from international NGOs, but from grant money and from government money that was trying to assess that. So all of that goes into that international aid that we often think goes to people on the ground, but most of it doesn't. And it still doesn't.
That was surprising to me to learn that. Is that like the medical doctors running in, people running in with water, food? Are you including all of that into the NGO? Or is there sort of those immediate aid organizations that go in and set up the clinics and do all of that kind of stuff, feed the people right away because there's no water?
Right.
Are they included into that boom, or where does that all fit in?
Yeah, no, Linda, you're right. That's the exciting part and for me, really positive part, right? So when the international community got involved, led by the US, something I remain very proud of, we stopped the violence, we stopped the rapes, we provided assistance, we provided healthcare, we provided emergency assistance, we helped with landmines. But part of that boom then is after that emergency part is over, in the past, the NGOs would return home. They wouldn't have investments. The difference in the Balkans was this kind of broader democratic plan for creating a multi-ethnic country after the violence. And so there was this belief that, well, if these NGOs kind of morphed, there's this idea of NGOs kind of changing their agenda. So they first do emergency care, then they do healthcare, then they start working on developing the healthcare sector. So they just kind of constantly are morphing. That's the part that it just gets complicated, because then there's different loyalties, there's different agendas. You can see that some people maybe are not staying on for the right reasons, or they might be taking away local jobs from locals who could carry out those positions. So that was kind of the difference in the Balkans. In a lot of other conflicts during the Cold War period, the United States or Western countries, the NGOs would return home and they would go about and the country would go about their business. But when the Cold War ended and there was this kind of uncertain leadership and the United States didn't know what role to play, there wasn't a Soviet Union anymore, the 1990s were kind of this unique era of humanitarianism that really has changed a lot since then. But there was prolonging of the missions and also the changing of the missions, getting involved again with civil society development and doing things that they just hadn't done in the past.
So then what contributes to the bust then?
Yeah. So the bust is when the money starts to dry up. And I will say that this was something that was really a President Clinton era policy. He was the president who really started to try to privatize a lot of US government projects and humanitarian assistance. So we did have NGOs, as you know, long before that. But in the 1990s, there was this proliferation of new NGOs and the privatization of humanitarian assistance. So the bust happens when a government needs to pivot and go to a different country. And then all of a sudden, the interest, the excitement of Bosnia goes away, they go to Kosovo, then things start up in Afghanistan, then all the NGOs literally were packing up, trying to figure out how to redo their proposals so they can start working in Kandahar rather than in Mitrovica. So that's when the bust happens. And then the NGOs, and I have some great quotes I think I put in my book about Afghanistan. An NGO pops up one week, it goes away a month later, and then pops up in another town. Just as money comes in, they're trying to figure out, ways to spend it. But that money and people's interest really dries up. And there's lots of other things to complicate that funding stream.
Then what they leave behind is a country that has not built the infrastructure to move forward. There has been a dependency on these Western NGOs, on the Western dollars that have created the situation where they haven't had the opportunity to build those supports themselves. And so they, in some ways, end up worse off than when they started.
Yeah, and there were a lot of Bosnian politicians and government officials that I really disagreed with on so many issues. And they were real nationalists and really tried to divide ethnic groups. But that point they were very clear on is Westerners are not supporting government structures, so we can't do anything. And in Afghanistan, we know that's part of what happened in Afghanistan, is that there's really not a state in Afghanistan and not a strong state at all, right? But tons of NGOs would go in, they'd have their pet project. The government sometimes didn't even know who was doing what, where, when, or how. And so they're like, what's going on here? And for me, this was something that when I went to Vietnam, which is, as you know, a communist country, everything is very centralized, it's very formalized, and they do not want international NGOs coming and doing their pet projects without them knowing. And, you know, I can understand that. I can totally understand why they want centralization. They want to create their priorities. They want maybe some of the money to flow through them, or if it's not flowing through them, at least for Vietnam, they're saying, no, you can do that, but we want to be in charge of where the projects happen, how they happen, have some accountability. That was the other thing that I became just more sensitive to and aware of, was that accountability gap. Like, who is really holding these organizations, these really good-hearted people from Nebraska who have an NGO in Rwanda or whatever, which we do, who's holding them accountable? And, you know, government certainly isn't perfect, but at least there is some structure there. And that's really what still exists in Bosnia and in Kosovo, is just lack of accountability, lack of structure, because, you know, there were so many external actors basically doing what they wanted to do.
That leads us to something we talked about in our prior podcast, is how do we, as givers, people that want to support and help, how do we determine which organizations are the ones to support, the ones that are going to give the money to the people that need it, or that there's more accountability if you want to help?
I know. I've thought about this a lot. I would come back from trips being very discouraged and, you know, telling my husband about all of the things that I saw, the money that was wasted, the offices that were empty. It's better than spending money on guns. And it's not as though they were always or inherently doing anything bad, but it was just so far removed from my reality that I do not give to any international NGOs. I give money to local organizations that I can see. I know it's about trust. It's about relationships, organizations that I know have good reputations. But if people do want to give to international causes, Charity Navigator is probably the best one. It tells you how they rank the NGOs. It provides a history, and it's a good way for an NGO that might have a unique niche, maybe doing things that others aren't doing. It's a good way for them to get the word out about the organization. And you as a donor will be able to say, well, wow, 90% of their money is going towards projects. That's the kind of organization. Or, you know, you visit somewhere and you visit Bosnia and you're like, I really do want to give to this town, and I see, you know, how beautiful it is. You can go to an organization and look up its history, look up how much people in the organization are getting paid. You can look at those projects.
That is fantastic, Nance. That's what we were looking for.
That is what we were looking for.
Thank you.
The book really is a pretty sobering look at the ineffectiveness of Westerners in their attempts to rebuild countries. But near the end of the book, there's a chapter called The End of the Golden Era, where you reviewed other peacebuilding efforts that have gone similarly awry. Afghanistan, Cambodia, East Timor, Rwanda, Haiti, Sri Lanka, goes on and on. There's a graveyard of failed efforts. Yet you also indicate there are some glimmers of hope, and that maybe NGOs are really learning from their mistakes and will be more helpful and less harmful in the future. So are you hopeful about these peace building efforts as we move forward? Have we learned enough, or is this going to be more of the same? Unfortunately, we know there are conflicts going on right now. There will be conflicts that will happen in the future. Westerners will want to go in and help. We probably will still want them to become democracies. We probably will want them to become capitalistic economic systems. What are your thoughts moving forward? Are you hopeful? Are we going to learn how to do this well?
Yeah, I am an optimist fundamentally at heart. I am. And I also think that, this is a discouraging, sobering look at humanitarian assistance. I hope that there are some optimistic, positive stories about ways that Westerners and Western NGOs have made a difference and have been positive. I mean, the alternative also is awful, right? Do nothing and sit and watch ethnic cleansing, genocide, and rapes. So the book is meant to be kind of sobering and more, and I hope, an honest assessment. But I do think that international NGOs have learned a lot. I think Western governments have learned a lot. I think there still is a funding gap. There's an empowerment gap. There's an accountability gap. There's a motivation gap about really changing the system. But I'm optimistic because we're talking about those things and we're saying, here's what we've learned. The alternative is to do nothing. And none of us wants to sit around and watch conflict. If we can make a difference, that's just human nature. We have done a better job. I think, again, I point to organizations like Oxfam. Catholic Relief Services also has done their own internal assessments of what they've done wrong and what they've done right, and they've improved their efforts. And Catholic Relief Services is another international NGO that I've interviewed a lot and followed in different places. They do learn. Oxfam is trying to empower locals a lot more, and they've really made, these are the things that we know are the problems. Here's how we're trying to address them here. Still didn't get it right. Here's how we're addressing them more. I think also that people are less enamored with the privatization of humanitarian aid and the realization that governments, at least for some countries, for some people, that governments really do matter and we need governments. My current project is an international project with women in Poland, the Czech Republic, Canada, and the US, looking at civil society and civil society's reaction in Central and Eastern Europe. But what we've been talking about a lot is maybe with COVID, there'll be more of an appreciation of the need for NGOs to work more with government and work in other sectors. So I guess my answer is I was discouraged, and I think a lot of the findings in my book are certainly not positive. But I hope that what I show is that people, for the most part, have good intentions. Organizations do want to make a difference, and they have learned from some of their mistakes in the 1990s and 2000s.
You told us a little bit about, your involvement with women. Do you want to say more about that or other projects maybe that you're working on?
Yeah, so the current project is funded by the Polish Science Foundation, and it's a comparative study that is looking at the developments in civil society in 5 post-communist countries. I have colleagues that are working in different countries, and we created a survey instrument to look at different ways that people are engaging in civil society. So we're looking at formal activism, informal activism, and kind of, for me, a lot of the interesting, cool kinds of civil society activism that's going on in Central and Eastern Europe. And that's my current project. So it's called 30 Years After Civil Society in Post-Communist Countries.
So are you going to publish that work?
In fact, we just recently submitted a proposal for a special edition of a journal, and all of us have not received our comments back, but for the most part, we got through the first level, and we'll probably have a whole special edition on civil society activism 30 years after kind of the end of communism. So we're excited about that.
Oh, that is exciting. I'm looking forward to reading that.
We're excited about finally getting it published. We got the grant 2 years ago from the Polish Science Foundation, and we hope to do some more interviews when we can that relate to how COVID may or may not or have differentially impacted civil society activism in these different countries.
So where can people best stay in touch with you?
The best way to get in touch with me is through email. And I'm at pmcmahon2, PMCMAHON2 at UNL.edu.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us on the Front Porch. This was just a wonderful opportunity to think broadly about these kind of international issues. And the work that you've done has cast a very important light on the impacts that we're having.
Well, thank you. And again, I want to end on an optimistic note, because I do think that individuals and organizations can make a difference, but we should always be thinking about our impact and always trying to make sure that what we're intending to do, that we're getting the kinds of outcomes that we hope to see.
Well, that's like the perfect ending, right? That's the takeaway that I needed to hear, because that's what I'm going to be thinking of the next time I see a need that's international. It's so quick for us to open up a checkbook, but to really think through, where is that money going? I'm going to check that website out that you gave. This has helped me to move on and learn a lot about the impact. And I appreciate your passion in this kind of work, because I value your research. I believe in supporting organizations that are going to help people. So I really appreciated all the work that you did on that.
And Linda, I look forward to seeing you in March for the big play, for the opening, for the week-long party that we're going to have, right?
Absolutely. I'll be there.
Oh, you guys are great. Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Okay,
Patrice.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, my goodness, Nancy, that was a lot of information, but I can see why she's a good teacher, because she takes some very complicated and complex subject matter, and she's able to teach it to us so that we can understand and put it in a nice little package for us to think about. This is important information for me. I mean, obviously for everyone in America that likes to give to these things, but this is going to impact my giving in the future. And as hard as it is to read the book and to realize how ethnocentric our country is, none of us want to do harm in our giving either. I mean, it really is a sobering look at this whole NGO game.
Yeah. And when we fail at this, like we have,
yes,
in the ways that Patrice documents, what we're not achieving is tragic, because we all love democracy here in the United States. We think it is the best form of government. We want people to be able to determine for themselves who is in charge of their government. But when we fail at these efforts, I think these countries are more vulnerable to then be taken over by fascist governments or others who want to take advantage of a weakened system.
Sobering.
Yeah.
Really interesting. Okay, now we're going to really change our gears here, Nance.
Yep, I can hear him grinding.
It's going to be September. And it's going to be Jane on the Brain by Wendy Jones.
I love Jane Austen.
You and me both. So now we are going to look at that book. You may remember back in March, I guess it was, our first guest, Sarah Crawford, our niece,
yes,
recommended this book to us. And we are going to do that for a fall kickoff. So if you like Jane Austen, which I know a lot of people do, you're going to want to pick up that book.
I'm really looking forward to talking to Wendy Jones about this book.
You could pick up that book by clicking on our page. You can purchase Jane the Brain right there. And that's what I'm going to do, because I have not read this book yet. I am looking forward to it. It's going to be a great summer read. Get that downloaded and join us. I'm excited for it.
Yep, that'll be great. Our episodes come out twice a month, the first and third Wednesday of every month. And if you like the show, leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. That helps people find the show who might be interested in it.
Okay, check us out at FromPorchBookClub.com. Nancy, I will see you later.
Sounds great.
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.